They thought a mop and a badge were the lowest place I could be. 15 years later, I turned the badge into a key and unlocked the boardroom door. The room smells like new paint and bitter coffee. The fluorescent lights make the chrome of the conference table hem a thin, cold line. My palm rests on the wood where once I knelt with my elbows on the floor scrubbing gum from under the far end. The same surface that will hold the signatures that change someone's life. The irony tastes like metal in my mouth, and for a second, all I can feel is the memory of a mop bucket clacking against linoleum. Stay with me. The part you think you know is only the beginning. People like to draw two straight lines between then and now, dirt and polish, exile and triumph. Life is never that tidy. The truth I carry is a thread stitched through rusted hardware, cheap coffee, and a small, stubborn heart that refused to fold. I was 23 when they pushed me out. I was 5 months pregnant and washing the elevator buttons, rotating the blue mop handle until my knuckles ached, when the assistant director stopped me mid-swipe. He didn't look at my stomach. He looked at my badge, then at the way I wrapped my fingers around the mop head like a talisman. "We have to see you in HR," he said, as if scheduling a routine review. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that polished cruelty into something presentable. The room in human resources had blinds that never fully closed. It smelled faintly of citrus and the brand of disinfectant we used in the offices upstairs, product that I knew the name of better than most of the men who paid for it. I remember the girl's voice from the front desk, low and mechanical, the way she said my first name with a curious tilt, like a question. They laid it out without pretense. Complaints had surfaced. There had been concerns about my conduct, an allegation that suggested instability, a rumor threaded through an email chain. It didn't matter that none of the witnesses were present. It didn't matter that the accusations were thin and contradicting as tissue paper. What mattered was the rhythm of the moment. Someone in the building had decided that my pregnancy made me a liability, and they had the power to make risk into reason. "Given the circumstances," the HR manager said carefully, "we're going to have to terminate your employment effective immediately." My fingers tightened around the strap of the duffel I kept under my locker. In it, my lunch, a change of clothes, a small pair of booties I had folded into a plastic bag and hidden in a pocket. I had thought I could keep them secret until the right time. I had imagined telling my sister and her kids at Thanksgiving, the whole kitchen smelling like adobo and laughter. The bag was suddenly weightless in my hands. They escorted me out with a security guard who kept his foot a respectful distance from mine, as if I might be contagious. People on the second floor turned and stared, the silence like an audience waiting to applaud the tragedy. Someone, maybe the assistant director, maybe someone more senior, made a show of pushing aside the mop closet door while we passed, as if to remind the world of where I belonged. The same closet where I had kept a dented thermos and a handwritten timetable for my night classes. The mop stood like a lonely sentinel inside, its fibers still damp. I walked past a child's drawing taped to the janitor's bulletin board, crayon suns and crooked houses with the words "Beat the Germs" scrawled beneath in mismatched letters. It looked like a little map to a place I had been close to losing, the life I had been trying to build. They said I could file an appeal. They gave me papers with phrases like company policy and at-will employment, and an email address for further questions. The security guard watched me until I passed the revolving doors, and the city opened up like a wise mouth. It was October, and the wind had teeth that day. It lifted the hem of my jacket, and I could see, for a second, the baby bump I had been trying to keep out of other people's sight. For a moment I thought maybe someone would stop me, that someone would say this was wrong, but the street kept moving, and the city had a way of swallowing people whole. The first night we slept on a friend's couch. My sister Anna fed me soft rice and tried not to cry when she looked at my belly. "We will find a way," she said, and I believed her, because I had to. We moved twice that winter, each time a little farther from the place where I had held a mop and a life at the same time. My ex, Daniel, if you can call him that, we had never married, sat me down in the tiny kitchen of the apartment where he kept his work boots by the door. His face was flat, the way of someone who had calcified around a decision. He didn't look at my stomach either. "This will complicate things," he said, as though the baby were paper that had been accidentally folded and could be smoothed out. When the first legal letter arrived, it was mailed in plain white envelope. It was not a lawyer's letter, but a notice that the company had lodged a complaint, and that, pending an investigation, they were limiting my access to bank accounts tied to my previous work. My paycheck, which I had counted on to secure a security deposit for a small apartment, was held by an administrative freeze labeled review. My landlord called.
Everything that had been ordinary became complicated by the fact of accusation. The smear came in drips, and then a flood. A post on a local gossip feed hinted at unprofessional conduct. Someone took a photo of me entering the building on a day I had tried to collect my duffel and turned it into a headline. Pregnant janitor seen in building after allegations. Someone called the welfare department and implied neglect.
Each small rumor was a thin splinter that accumulated into a worry too large to ignore. I learned that the true cruelty of power is not the ability to punish outright, but the ability to marinate a life in suspicion. We moved again, this time to a studio 3 blocks from the city line. The heat was unreliable, the bathtub was too old to drain properly. I found a night shift at a large hospital on the outskirts, pushing a cart with a wrinkled mop and the kind of disinfectant that smells of lemon and tiredness. I slept with the phone on the counter next to the small stack of pregnancy books I bought secondhand. I read about delivery positions and breastfeeding in the early hours, when the world had the pooled silence of a waiting room. At night, with the lights off and the city far behind the thin walls, I thought of what had been taken from me without trial: a job, a reputation, a sense of belonging. I thought of names called out in the building like a roll call of a life that no longer included me. I said them over until the syllables became a list I could manage. Evelyn, the assistant director; Paula, HR; Mr. Hargrove on the 10th floor, who had laughed at my jokes one summer when he asked for a coffee and I gave him 2 spoons too many sugar by mistake. None of them lifted a finger. No one said, "This is wrong." The first person who did was my brother, Luca. He showed up at the studio one rainy morning with a thermos of coffee and an extra blanket. He had that look he gets when he is trying not to be angry. His jaw tightens and his hands fiddle with the car keys like a man at a funeral trying to find a rhythm. "You're not alone," he said. He took the old mop from the corner and leaned it against his shoulder like a flag. "We will get you a lawyer." I didn't want to add legal bills to the pile, but I was tired of being acted upon. I wanted to act. Luca introduced me to Maya, a lawyer who taught night classes at the community college and took pro bono cases for people she believed had been wronged. Maya smelled like peppermint and resolved, and when I told her the story, her mouth didn't tighten or twitch. It simply said, "We'll collect everything. Emails, messages, anything," she said. "Document. Do not respond to the social press. Let us do the talking." It was the first practical sentence I had heard in months. I started a file on my phone and labeled everything evidence. The habit of documentation, screen grab, timestamp, note, became a small armor. With Maya's help, we did what we could: a perfunctory appeal, an internal complaint against the manager who had led the decision, a request for public records. The company replied with boilerplate: "We steadfastly protect the safety of our workplace." The reply said nothing. Its opacity was the point. If you asked me then whether I imagined I'd return, I would have laughed until my sides hurt and the baby did a somersault. I didn't see a future that included titles or keys. I saw rent, diapers bought on sale, night shifts, and the little marathon of hope that is single parenting. The months blurred into years like low-contrast film. I learned to find opportunity in the little grains of life. When a small chain of coffee shops needed after-hours cleaning, I offered to subcontract with my friend Maria, someone who had a truck, and we took 1 store, then 3. I hired 2 women from the shelter who had small children and big laughter. We called ourselves Clearline. We cleaned with a strictness that looked like care. We treated clients like neighbors. The first contract meant a second set of sheets, which meant my son, born in a quiet delivery room with my sister humming something like a Tagalog lullaby against the beeping monitors, could have a chair of his own. Parenthood altered how I measured risk. Where once I had been afraid of losing a job, now I was afraid of losing my ability to be there. I worked days and nights. I counted pennies and my son's teeth. I went to classes: operations, procurement, small business accounting, anything that would teach me how to make the small machine of a company work. I learned to bid. I learned unit cost and morale, the art of holding a schedule together when 3 staff called in sick and a client threatened to cancel. We were good at cleaning. More than that, we were good at noticing the small things other firms wrote off: a cracked tile that became a lawsuit, a faulty step light that turned into a safety hazard, a janitor's insistence that a window latch be fixed before the storm. My attention to these details started to turn into a reputation. A building manager from uptown noticed that our logs were meticulous and that our staff didn't leave the premises with half-empty carts. He recommended us to his friends. Clients that once would have scoffed at an unknown contractor began to call. A turning point came when a small private school called because their nightly cleaner had walked away halfway through the semester. They were on a tight budget and needed someone with references they could trust. I sent Maria and 2 of our staff and stayed awake that night waiting for the call. They called in the morning and said the headmistress had asked to meet me. She was older than I expected, with small, astute eyes. "We need someone who understands children," she said. She showed me a crayon drawing taped to the staff room wall, a house with a crooked son and a smiling stick family. "When you clean, you don't just pick up dirt," she said.
You hold a place where children learn. People forget that. We got the contract. The school's treasurer called us a lifesaver in an email that I printed and kept. Word spread like the clean scent we left in the hallways. Our client list grew. We hired an operations assistant, then a project manager. I learned to trust people with keys. Keys, they became a motif in my life.
For a long time, keys meant places I couldn't access. Then they became instruments of permission. A quiet accumulation of competence and kindness makes its own gravity. After 5 years, Clearline was not small enough to be invisible. We were contractually obliging and legally tidy and fiscally improving. We instituted paid sick days and a simple grievance process for our staff because I had been on the other end of the system and knew how easily dignity could be tossed like a mop rag. Someone from a facilities management company, Westbridge, reached out after seeing a write-up in a trade newsletter about our low staff turnover and high client satisfaction. Westbridge was mid-sized, a company that managed buildings in the same neighborhoods where I had swept floors, the same spaces that once had felt like glass ceilings. They had clients we wanted, and vice versa. The recruiter who called was smooth, her voice the practiced warmth of someone who sold transitions as opportunities. "We admire your ethic," she said. "We'd like to propose a partnership." The next 5 years were an exercise in incremental expansion. We merged some contracts, Westbridge bought a minority stake, I agreed to become head of operations for a new division. There were meetings about integration and culture, long runs of spreadsheets, and nights full of invoices. There were quiet arguments over who got credit for what. There were victories, a 6-figure contract with a corporate campus, a city bid that changed our trajectory. There were losses too, a client who chose a cheaper bid, a staff member who left after they didn't like the new hierarchy. Every small thing taught me how to sit in a room and make decisions without feeling guilty for the cost. The man who led Westbridge then, Dean Mercer, had a handshake like a promise. He admired my ability to smooth logistical knots. He told me once, over a bland catered lunch, that he found my attention to detail inspiring. "You don't just clean," he said. "You see the architecture of care." I thought of that mop closet, its stale odor and fraying rag. The compliment felt like a measuring stick being held up to a life. All the while, someone watched. Evelyn, there's a name that likes to linger in a mouth like smoke. She had been the assistant director who had overseen the floor I cleaned. She rose through a company the way some people build towers, careful floor by floor. After I left, rumor threaded around that she had recommended a restructuring that undermined the janitorial staff. I heard her name every time I heard someone say, "We had to reduce headcount," with a patient shrug. Years later, I ran into her at a municipal event for local businesses. She had kept the same hair, the same immaculate statement code. Her smile was perfectly polished to deflect consequence. We exchanged the sort of public pleasantries that people give when 2 lines in a city's history intersect briefly.
She said, "I see you've done well for yourself." And I said nothing for a second, because to answer would be to cross a distance that had changed me. Evelyn didn't forgive easily. She kept collections of grievances like someone collecting stamps, neatly catalogued, framed in memos. I didn't know then that she had mentioned my name in meetings, that she had rumbled about the liability I represented, that she had watched my company grow and felt the prickle of displacement. There are people who keep score and people who forget the scoreboard exists. Evelyn remembered. Small acts of attention, when directed with intent, become instruments. Allegations began to drift past, thin and vindictive in tone. An anonymous blog, one of those hyperlocal sites that thrives on scandal, ran a piece about a corporate takeover by the janitor-turned-entrepreneur. The piece suggested impropriety, nepotism, back-channel bids, favoritism. It cited anonymous insiders and attached photos from old events where I had been photographed with Westbridge's team. The piece had no real evidence, but evidence was not what it needed. It needed clicks. Once it had momentum, other sites republished the headline with their own speculative add-ons. When the first threatening email arrived at the school where my son studied, addressed simply to the mother of the CEO, my heart rearranged itself into a brittle shape. The sender claimed to be concerned, a common euphemism for a provocation waiting to happen. The message implied that if someone in a position to influence policy had a troubling past, that might pose risks to the children. The school called me, voice hovering like a moth, trying to be helpful and frightened for the possible fallout. Maya told me to document everything and breathe in the interstices between alerts. "They are trying to create a picture where none exists," she said. "We will frame it for what it is, harassment." We hired a PR firm that specialized in crisis containment and had the soft, sinister vocabulary of people who put out fires for a living. "We recommend transparency," they said. "We build a narrative of trust."
Their team drafted statements that balanced humility and authority. They called late into the night with media lists and damage assessments. I sat in the glow of the laptop screen and tried to think of what dignity looked like in a press release. There were private moments in which the old fear returned, an animal fear that lives in the gut. At 3 a.m, when the house was a round hollow of quiet and the city beyond the windows breathed, my son would turn in his sleep and say, "Mom," in the fragile voice of a child, and I would be awake, cataloging what else could be taken. I became hypervigilant with the kind of tenderness that has edges. I taught him where to go if a stranger came to the door. I taught him that the world sometimes says things that aren't true, and the truth matters more because of that.
Fine-grained paranoia isn't heroic, but it's useful. It led me to install cameras at our facility entrances, not to spy for revenge, but to protect the staff who trusted me. I refused to use them against anyone's private life. They were for common documentation. I learned to read a pattern, a number of anonymous accounts that had watched Westbridge and Clearline, liking old posts, commenting in ways that had the tiny brutality of a raised eyebrow captured in type. We traced a trail to a virtual throwaway account that had once followed Evelyn's company's official page. It was not, by itself, proof, but suspicion was a thread, and threads can be followed. When I stepped back into the building where I'd once worked as a janitor, this time not on my knees but on my feet with a badge that read CEO, there was a small, dizzying moment where my life felt like a split-screen film. The mop closet was behind a new access panel. The hallway was newly carpeted, and someone had installed plants that looked expensive. A receptionist I half remembered glanced up, her expression doing that rapid arithmetic people perform when someone returns different. I ran a fingertip along the edge of the conference table like a person touching a relic. The table held the ghosts of suits who had once signed me out. Now people took notes in front of me. They deferred, not because I demanded it, but because the world defers to authority. It is a strange thing to hold the position that used to decide you had to go. There are comfortable moments that come with power, an assistant who brings the right files, a legal team that moves in step with a plan. But the undercurrent never leaves. I had learned to be careful, to balance the ledger of my life. I had learned that leadership is an operational ethic and an ethical temperament. It is not vindication. It is the opportunity to ensure other people do not suffer the small, invisible cruelties I had endured. Someone in the boardroom cleared their throat, and the room spun back into the present. I gave the opening lines about a new employee wellness program and the steps we were taking to protect low-wage workers during renovations. I spoke about better sick day policies and a confidential line for people who wanted to report workplace concerns without fear. My words were measured because words can be both tools and weapons. When I finished, the room applauded politely. The applause felt like manufactured snow on top of a hill someone had spent years shaping. That night, I took a walk to clear my head. The street lamps looked like distant lighthouses, rings of light on asphalt. I passed a bodega where a boy had taped a crayon drawing to the window, 3 stick figures and a broad sun with "Be kind" written beneath it. I thought of the janitor's board with its crooked suns, of the child's drawing taped to the stairwell in the old building. These small pieces of paper, cheap pigment on cheap stock, kept appearing in my life.
They were reminders that some things remained rooted in the small hands of ordinary people. Then the first real escalation arrived. It wasn't the gossip blog, nor the anonymous comment threads. It was a printed photograph slipped under the door of my home office, placed carefully at the baseboard, with the sort of precision that felt cold and deliberate. I picked it up with shaking fingers. The image was grainy, taken from a distance. It showed a man and a woman in an embrace in front of a storefront. Evelyn, unmistakable even through the pixelation, and a younger man whose face I recognized from a board photo years ago. The back of the photo had a handwritten note. Not everything is forgiven. A week later, an email thread made the rounds through the industry grapevine. Is this the same woman who left Westbridge's cleaning team in shambles? Someone had dug up archived internal documents, redacted fragments, that when strung together implied negligence. The documents were selectively quoted, out of context, and peppered with commentary that read like a prosecution without a judge. The headline on the local paper's website read, "Former janitor, now CEO. Questions arise." It wasn't a direct accusation. Lawyers know how to leave the hard part implied, but it was enough to make people look sideways. Maya wanted to file libel. The PR firm recommended a measured response. We will address inaccuracies, provide supporting documentation, and reassert our values. Meanwhile, Evelyn's name kept showing up in the shifts of the rumor mill. Her LinkedIn profile had a flurry of activity from anonymous accounts that posted questions beneath her updates, as if to smear public praise with doubt.
I slept for an hour at a time those nights. I moved like a person walking across a thin ice of fear. My son watched me monitor the news with a kind of worried curiosity I hated to see. "Are they saying ugly things about you, Mom?" he asked once, his voice small in the kitchen. "Sometimes," I said, "but we have to be careful. People sometimes say things to try to hurt." I did not tell him that the hurt feels like a physical weather system, a low-pressure front you never completely leave. Then came the call from a Westbridge board member. "There's an article." His voice was clipped and professionally distant. "Stakeholders are asking for an emergency review. There's a request to examine prior conduct for compliance." I closed my eyes and felt the blood hum in my ears. Compliance reviews are procedural. They are not necessarily lethal, but in the corridors of corporate governance, they make those with uncertain allies sweat. They hand power to those who keep old grudges. They are instruments that can be wielded by people who know how to steer a meeting. "This is a smear," I said into the receiver. My voice sounded small in my own ear. "We have records. We can show our processes, our contracts." "Bring what you have," he said.
We will review it in the next board meeting. Board meetings are different when one is on the inside. They are rooms filled with rational faces, subtle alliances, and silent votes. The air is dry with the perfume of social capital. I would need to stand at a table that some of the same people once used to close the door on me, and explain myself in the language of liability and trust. When I walked into the building the next morning, there was a folded child's drawing left on the bench outside the elevators. It was a crude, careful picture, a stick family with a son that had a little frown drawn into it, and at the bottom, in jagged letters, the words, "Tell the truth." I picked it up and felt the paper tremble. I could have let fury carry me into an act of retaliation. It would have been easy to arrange a spectacle, an incriminating dossier against Evelyn, a public unmasking. But the truth had been my defense for 15 years. Messy, incomplete, but true. Truth, paired with strategy, is a far more useful weapon than indignation. Maya and I met in my office, the city stretching below like a map. She had a folder stuffed with exhibits, old HR emails, pay stubs, a notarized letter from a supervisor who had left the company, and since then refused to be a part of any smear. We organized a timeline, dates that matched photographs, assignments, the months I'd taught myself business math between night shifts. We had a chain of custody for the contracts we had won, invoices with stamped dates, witness statements from the staff who had worked for me when Clearline was still a one-truck operation. "You can't beat them with fury," Maya said. "You beat them with documentation and with the facts that matter in a boardroom, contracts, compliance certificates, audited financials." She is good at translating the world into a language that neutralizes fear. Numbers, documents, witness testimony. It felt almost like applying antiseptic to a wound that had been weeping for a long time. Still, legal strategy cannot always fight the human things that smear campaigns target: trust, intimacy, reputation. They make a person in a small town or an administrative office feel too exposed to be comfortable. People begin to ask questions at dinner parties, and children at school parrot the words they've heard online without grasping their meaning. The day before the board review, my phone buzzed. An anonymous tweet had gone viral, a rough video stitched together from a conference where I had once taken questions from a reporter. The editing made the moment look as if I had been dismissive of worker concerns when I was 28 and new to dealing with a particularly thorny client. The footage was doctored, nothing egregiously obvious, but enough to color a public impression for those who don't know how to press pause. Social feeds filled with commentary, and a hashtag gathered momentum.
I sat at my kitchen table with a mug that had once been my mother's, the glaze chipped at the handle. My son was at school, and the quiet in the apartment was brittle. I texted Luca. "They've started." He replied with an emoji of a fist, and under it 3 words, "We got you." When I arrived at the Westbridge campus from the board meeting, people looked at me with the kind of expression you give a person who has been through something and come out the other side changed. It was not pity, it was assessment. I felt my old janitor instinct kick in. Notice the small things, the way the carpeting bunches at the door, the hue of the coffee. It steadied me. The boardroom filled like a lake catching rain. The chairman sat at one side, potential allies and potential predators in suits. The boardroom was the one place my past and present really collided. There they could ask the questions that mattered. Did you mismanage a contract? Did you falsify documents? Did your past undermine your ability to protect the company's reputation? I was prepared for those questions. I had exhibits neatly bound, and Maya at my side. I expected resistance, and I had strategies in place. What I had not expected was a sealed envelope slid across the table before the meeting began, eyes like small stones watching me as I opened it. Inside was a copy of a complaint filed with the county family court, an anonymous sheen of accusation that suggested neglect.
It was dated that morning and bore the kind of hand manila envelopes are made to hide behind. It wasn't a legal bar to remove me from the company. It was a social sword meant to make the board flinch. The clerk's stamp made it real enough to plant doubt in those who prefer the safe harbor of removal over the risk of staying. I looked up and saw Evelyn across the room, seated with a polite smile in her own folder, like a person who had practiced the look of innocence. She caught my eye for the barest moment, and in that instant I understood something fundamental. She had spent a long time preparing to make this meeting the instrument of an old kind of power. My throat was dry. This was not the end. It might not even be the turning point, but it was a hinge. The next motion would swing the room one way or another. Documents would be assessed. Voices would be measured. The board secretary cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. Paper shifted. A laptop lid clicked open. The room, which had been full of the soft noises of a dozen people arranging their defenses, went quiet enough that I could hear the hum of the building's HVAC like the distant bass of a far-off storm. I pressed the child's drawing into my palm and kept my voice level. "Before we begin," I said, "I want to make something clear. This company exists to protect places where people live and work. My life before this meeting, my hardships, are not instructions for judgment. They are context. If you want facts, I have them."
If you want rumors, I will not dignify them. There was no theatrical rising of a curtain. The board asked for the exhibits. They listened to Maya's rationality. The secretary's eyes flicked to the complaint with a professional detachment that didn't quite reach human sympathy. Evelyn watched, the way a careful shark watches water. The meeting moved into a rhythm of numbers and policies. I presented, crisp and cold. At one point, a young board member, someone who had been hired last year and eyed me like a co-conspirator in efficiency, stood and asked a measured question about employee protections. His voice had the faint tremor of a person who had seen enough headlines to know which way the wind might blow. We were in the middle of a line item when my phone buzzed again. The screen lit with a breaking headline from a major local outlet. Ex-janitor, now CEO, under fire as new allegations surface. The link led to a page where the anonymous complaint was replicated, and beneath it, a thread of comments that read like a slow-motion vendetta. Maya's jaw tightened. She had the look of a person realizing the scale had shifted. I felt the old sensation, the mop handle in my hands, the cold tile under my knees. This time I was not on my knees before a manager. I was at the head of the table, and the table expected me to produce the kind of calm that breaks storms. I inhaled and held the breath long enough to feel the paperwork rustle. The room watched. Evelyn's smile had softened into something that was almost pity. The board's chair adjusted his glasses and called for order. There are moments in life that taste like iron. This was one of them. Outside the windows, the city kept going. People commuted to other jobs, brewed other coffees. Inside, a life that had been shaped by small acts of dignity and impossible nights was being measured against accusations born from the same instruments of power that had once forced Lee to leave. I set my phone face down, folded the child's drawing, and slid it into my folder. I had no desire to be consumed by the panic of social feeds. I had documents, witnesses waiting in the wings, and a lawyer who could boil down rumor to nothing more than paper. Yet my hands shook once, just enough that I had to press them against the edge of the table and look at the seam of the wood. This was not a story I had wanted to tell in public. It was a story I had wanted to bury in a life of honest labor and quiet success. But sometimes the world insists on making a public out of a private survival. Sometimes the past is a hand that will not release you until you make a decision about its grip. The board called for a closed session. The heavy door shut with a sound like a gavel. The hum of the HVAC swelled until it was the only sound I could hear. Chairs scraped, paper shuffled. The room cleaved itself into a small island of consequence.
When the door opened again, faces were arranged the way they always are after a storm, composed, with the strain of choices made under pressure. The chair declared they would form a subcommittee to review the complaint and any new evidence. He asked that all members refrain from public comment until their review was complete. The door reopened, and the world resumed its soft corporate hum. The chair spoke of procedure. The secretary's watch glinted. People folded papers like talons folding into their pockets. They would form a subcommittee, the chair said, and for the time being, no one would speak publicly. The language was meant to be neutral. It was also meant to keep the rumor alive enough to matter, without committing to anything that could hurt anyone important. I left the meeting with my folder lighter by the child's drawing, and heavier by the knowledge that being inside the room did not guarantee the room would protect me. It only guaranteed that the room could be used well or poorly. The subcommittee was a pause, not a resolution. Evelyn had, intentionally or not, given the complaint the gravity it needed to make people act on instinct. We tightened every loose end. Maya organized our exhibits into a chronology so clean it offended the chaos I'd lived through. She talked about chain of custody and witness statements like a conductor tapping a baton. Luca lined up interviews with staff from the early days of Clearline. Maria and 2 former employees agreed to testify about schedules and hours and the fact that we never folded invoices or fudged dates. The operations manager I'd hired 3 years ago provided spreadsheets with timestamped deliveries. The treasurer from the private school sent a notarized letter. Clearline provided consistent, documented service, it read. Little things, an invoice number, a stamped delivery receipt, a simple paid across a ledger, became bricks. Still, the smear worked because it was personal. The complaint referenced neglect in a way that asked people to imagine me as a woman who could not be trusted with children. The media loves that image, a small woman standing next to a big accusation, the color of the story already chosen. For a while, even when we had documentation, the court of public opinion asks different questions. Who does this person know? What secrets hide in the margins? We learn this all over again. Then the escalation shifted from rumor to action. Small things began to arrive in the mail. A glossy printout of an old performance review with a criticism highlighted in fluorescent marker. A photocopy of an HR memo, when you trace the header, had a different letterhead than the company used at the time, suggesting tampering. We filed everything. Each piece of paper taught us a different posture. Verify, notarize, timestamp. We traced the origins of items we could trace.
We pushed for CCTV footage from the building where the photograph had been taken and the envelope left at my door. The building's security office was reluctant at first, citing privacy and policy. Then, when the person in charge recognized my name, you're with Westbridge, the gates eased. There was a clip showing someone leaving a pamphlet under a door, then walking away. The angle was grainy. The person wore a coat. It was not conclusive proof of Evelyn's hand. But in the back of the footage, near the elevator, a pair of shoes registered familiar, a polished heel that matched a style Evelyn favored in archived photos. It was circumstantial, but circumstantial can be knitted into a narrative when corroborated by other links. One of the former administrative assistants from the old building, Sandra, called me out of the blue. She had left the company the year after I was expelled and had never spoken publicly. She said she was tired of walls that keep quiet because they suppose they are protecting the institution. She sounded small over the phone. In person, she looked older than her profile picture, a woman softened by years of bureaucracy. I shouldn't have kept quiet, she said, when we met for coffee in a place that smelled like caramel and workday patience. I remember a packet left on my desk once, no return address. Evelyn asked me to file it. I thought it was HR. I didn't look. I was scared. People get punished for asking too many questions. Did you see anything else? I asked, keeping my voice low as a person who has learned to save volume for crises when they matter. She slid a manila envelope across the table like a contraband offering. Inside were printed emails and notes, and a scrawl that matched one of the notations we had found. I never wanted to be the one to make trouble, she said, but this wasn't just housekeeping. People were writing things into existence about you. Her testimony was small but precise. She remembered a time when Evelyn would drop by Sandy's desk with items that Sandra wasn't sure belonged in the official file. There was an email thread Sandra had saved that reflected a culture of risk management euphemisms, a way of writing concern where a real conversation should have happened. She wrote a short affidavit. I believed the items Miss Mercer placed on my desk were intended to create a paper trail that would be used in future personnel deliberations. In bureaucratic circles, that sentence is not a hammer, it is a chisel, but a chisel can carve out an opening. Every new fact narrowed the field of plausible innocence. We developed what Maya called a persuasive architecture: timeline, witnesses, material evidence, and motive. The motive was the hardest part to show, because motive is the private flower that grows in the shade of greed or fear.
Evelyn's motive, as we teased it out, was not a single moment of malice. It was a long accumulation of feeling overlooked, of professional insecurity kitted into administrative acts that looked like policy. She had, in our evidence and in multiple recollections, spoken of stability and reputation in a way that suggested she saw my presence as a threat to a balance she had spent years keeping. Her emails, those we could find, made references to risk in relation to people who had unsettling profiles. The words were sanitized, but the meaning was there. In the weeks leading up to the subcommittee's final meeting, the anonymous attacks evolved into a legal-looking package: a stack of documents sent to the county clerk, copies to the school, a letter to my son's pediatrician citing concern for his welfare. The last part was the cruelest. A social services investigator dropped by unannounced during a school pickup. The investigator was professional and kind, and the inquiry found nothing,
My son was well fed, his immunizations up to date, his teacher filed a note about his engagement in class. Still, the visit became a story in the rumor chain, repeated by the rumor mill as proof that someone with a history of questionable conduct had attracted official attention. I called Luca and told him the investigator had come. His voice tightened. "We will make it part of the record," he said. "Get me every note from the school, every email with details of that visit. We will file it." What happened to me when someone suggested my child might not be safe was immediate and animal. Fear recalibrated everything. For a few nights, I slept in the living room with the door locked, my phone on the table. My son noticed the change and, with the straightforward cruelty of children, asked if I was scared. "Sometimes," I said honestly, and then I explained what dignity looks like when it has to protect itself. Documentation, witnesses, letting other people speak for you when you cannot. I had built my company on the idea that small things matter. Tile cracks, latchwork, a broken bulb. Those small things are where real accidents begin. But when the small things are used as weapons, an edited clip, a highlighted memo, an anonymous envelope, they are no longer mere details. They are instruments of erasure. We had to prove not only that the details were false, but that someone had intentionally amassed them to cause harm. The subcommittee convened in a room smaller than the main boardroom, a room designed to make decisions without spectacle. The chair of the subcommittee, a woman whose face I had seen in public relations circles, efficient and sympathetic, opened the session with a civility that almost concealed the stakes. Each side presented our exhibits, Evelyn's rebuttals, the anonymous complaint. There were polite questioning, there were moments of impatience from people who'd rather have a different agenda.
There was real curiosity, people asking if I had any ongoing business conflicts, if there had been any contract anomalies. I answered with the facts, with the invoices, with the records of staff shifts and insurance. Halfway through, Sandra's voice came through the conference line. She spoke of the envelope on her desk and how she'd seen paperwork moved in ways that didn't sit right. She didn't call Evelyn a villain. She called the culture that made silence easier than accountability a problem. Her comment landed like a stone in a quiet river, and the ripples reached corners in the room that had previously felt safe. Evelyn sat with perfect posture. Her lawyer spoke in calm corporate rhythms about procedural propriety and preserving reputation. She denied involvement with the anonymous letters and the photograph. She suggested that someone else might have used the old email chain to create a narrative. She smiled occasionally in a way measured to convey hurt. It was a practice thing. When the subcommittee concluded its initial review, it recommended an internal investigation into procedural violations by certain employees and a forensic audit of document handling. That was a victory and a complication. The investigation was not a public punishment. It required a degree of patience I did not always possess. It would dig through files, interviews, and servers. It was, Maya said, an instrument that could either expose the pattern or slow us until the media moved on. We agreed to let it work. There was no faster, honest path to resolution. And then the worst of it arrived. An anonymous person began sending my son small notes in his backpack. They were not threatening in the grotesque kind of way. They were mocking, childish, the kind of thing a person uses to unsettle rather than inform. "Tell your mom she's a liar," one read. My son came home, confused. The school principal called a meeting with me. We walked through safety plans and the ways in which a school can be a sanctuary. The principal, Miss Alvarez, spoke with a quiet authority that felt like a steadying hand. "Children don't need a front-row seat to adult battles," she said, "but they do need honest adults who will shield them when necessary. We will keep his backpack safe and monitor for anything odd." I wanted, in that moment, to do something loud. I wanted to march into the streets and shout that the person who had built their career around regulations had broken those same rules. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and made lists. Who had access to the school? Which cameras recorded the corridor? Which signed-in volunteers had been present that week? We filed a report with the school and handed it to the investigator assigned to the anonymous letters. The investigator promised to treat it as harassment and to follow leads. It was the right thing to do. It was not enough to rid us of the dread. We found a thread that connected several of the harassment efforts. The throwaway social media accounts had, at different points, engaged with posts by an ex-employee who now worked as a freelance writer for a local outlet. That freelance writer's byline showed up on an article that had run an innocuous piece in a trade magazine about Westbridge leadership, but the same writer had been tagged in provocative threads the week the smear campaign intensified. The journalist, whose name I will keep private for obvious reasons,
Was a person both hungry for clicks and, according to a message I received from an anonymous tip, in contact with someone who would prefer the industry to remain the same? We did not know if the writer was a knowing accomplice or a naive tool. It mattered less than the fact that the chain ran through places we could follow. Maya drafted subpoenas we hoped the subcommittee would approve. The subcommittee obliged. The legal wheels, which in a past life had spun with the excruciating slowness of honey, suddenly had a momentum of their own. We got access to server logs, to email headers, to IP traces that showed where some of the anonymous accounts had originated. That is, they pointed to networks associated with devices in the old Westbridge offices. The data was not a smoking gun. It was a path. We followed it. Then, in an ordinary Thursday unfolded in a way that rearranged everything. A reporter from a major outlet reached out, asking if I'd be willing to be interviewed on live TV about the allegations and the company's response. The request was a test. Some reporters ask because they want the truth. Others ask because they want to make a story of the conflict. I agreed because truth has a way of sticking to places that light will find. The interviewer had a voice polished for conflict. She asked the obvious questions about the anonymous complaint, about the investigator's visit, about whether being a janitor had in some way predicted my failure as a CEO. I answered simply, my background is one of labor and care. It taught me to notice what others overlook. I'm here because I can do the job. During the segment, the anchor asked if I had any proof that the anonymous documents were manufactured. I didn't have hard proof then. I had threads that suggested improper handling and a former assistant who had stepped forward. I had a building camera that showed a figure leaving an envelope and possibly the silhouette of a heel that matched a shoe I had seen on an old event photo of Evelyn's. For the wider audience, those things might have been insufficient. For those who watched more closely, who had chosen to believe in the painstaking truth of documentation, the segment clarified that our response was not a tantrum, but a series of methodical steps. The segment aired, and the public reaction was a mix of sympathy and suspicion. There were online commentators who would not be persuaded.
There were 2 professionals within the industry who called to say they respected the way we handled contracts. The momentum was not entirely on my side. What it did, though, was shift the dynamic. The story was no longer only about me. It was about the chain of events that had been set into motion years ago and had finally been traced to an origin. A week later, a key thing happened. The subcommittee obtained copies of internal emails showing that Evelyn had shared a packet of documents related to staffing and concerns with a former vendor. In a note attached to the packet she had written, "For circulation to board confidant." That line suggested intent. Intent reframes a sea of circumstantial facts into a current with direction. It does not make a criminal case by itself. It does make a moral case. At a specially scheduled meeting, the subcommittee announced preliminary findings: procedural irregularities in how certain documents had been handled, suspicious timing of memos, sharing of personnel concerns outside of HR channels. The board moved to suspend Evelyn from any role involving personnel oversight pending a full investigation. They also demanded a retraction of specific allegations and asked the PR team to draft a statement clarifying the process for handling grievances. It was not a dramatic public firing. It was a corporate recalibration. But for me, it felt like a wall giving way. Evelyn left the meeting with a face that had been curated for public composure. I did not see her afterward. There was no scene in which justice was handed down like a gavel. Instead, there was a quiet unease that had settled in the corners of our industry, a recognition that systems could be weaponized and that people, often low-wage workers, could be the collateral damage. The legal person who had filed the anonymous complaint, if there ever had been a single person, remained hidden. The journalist's role was complicated. The freelance writer's notes indicated a willingness to accept leaked packets from a source described as industry insider. When contacted, the writer said they had acted in good faith and had been careful with fact-checking. That answer felt plausible and insufficient. It is the way that many conversations about responsibility end, with a shrug and a list of how the industry operates. The school principal invited me to a meeting with other parents to assure them of my son's well-being and to outline the steps we had taken to protect the children from the effects of adult conflict. Miss Alvarez's kindness was both practical and moral. She read a letter in which parents expressed support. "We know Maria's son, and he is a child with friends and teachers who care for him," one parent wrote, and another added, "We respect that a leader can also be a parent." My son handed me a crayon drawing that night, 3 stick figures with a big sun, and wrote in his careful letters, "Mom is brave."
I kept that drawing next to the folder with our court exhibits like an amulet. By the time the full investigation concluded, there was a pattern. Some of the documents had been improperly routed, there had been unauthorized copies. A culture of secrecy had allowed the manufacture of a narrative without checks. Evelyn was asked to resign from her managerial duties related to the floors and personnel. The company's reputation took a hit. There was no multi-million-dollar fine, no courtroom humiliation that satisfied a public craving for spectacle, just internal realignment, apologies couched in corporate language, and a recognition that policy must be stronger than gossip. The news stories shifted tone. An outlet that had once run a speculative piece printed an editorial about the dangers of unverified allegations and the responsibility of editors to vet sources. Another outlet retracted one of the more inflammatory posts and issued an apology for failing to substantiate its claims. It was not an erasure of the harm that had been done to me, but it was a clearing of space in which I could breathe. In the months after the investigation, I turned my energy inward. I redesigned our grievance process at Clearline to ensure anonymity and accountability in equal measure. We created a small fund to support employees who needed legal aid and implemented policies ensuring that complaints were handled by an independent committee. We trained staff on data handling and introduced an accessible third-party reporting line. The policies were pragmatic, not performative. They came from a woman who had been pushed out by the casual cruelty of bureaucracy and had learned how to build a machine that acknowledged the human cost of its operation. Love, quiet and steady, arrived the way good things often arrive after a long drought, slowly, in scenes of ordinary kindness. Rosa, she is a facilities engineer who consulted for us during a campus upgrade, would bring me tea after long negotiation sessions and, with a patience that felt miraculous, listened. She did not show up with grand gestures. She fixed the uneven step in my office with a screwdriver and a look of concentration that said more than words. She visited my son's school play and applauded the way parents clap for small things, the way they make a hum for children who cannot yet be shaken by adult storms. Rosa had her own slow scenes of history, an immigrant family, a father who taught her how to weld, a mother who sewed uniforms. She wore the habits of people who repaired things, the legibility of weld marks, the perfume of grease and determination. With her, I learned to rest without guilt. She taught me to take a night off and to trust that the world would not collapse if I stepped away. She was not a rescue, she was company. When Evelyn's resignation became public, she gave an interview that read like a litany of wounded pride.
She spoke of mistakes made under pressure and of the loneliness of leadership. I listened to it with a strange absence of triumph in my chest. Power reversals are not always sweet. They can be empty in their simplicity. I thought of Sandra and of the janitorial staff who had been waiting for someone to notice that when systems fail, their faces are the first to be erased. I thought of my son and Rosa and Luca and Maya, people who stayed. There was a final public hearing convened by the industry board months later to review corporate governance and to recommend changes to how allegations are handled. I was asked to testify. I prepared my notes like a person practicing meditation. I did not rehearse revenge. I rehearsed clarity. I spoke of the way the company had been my workplace and my world once, of the day I had been escorted out with a mop closet door pushed open as if to point and say, "There she goes." I spoke of the weight of being pregnant and homeless, and of the industry that allowed rumor to become sanction. I spoke of the steps we had taken to protect workers and the need for public mechanisms that would discourage weaponization of personnel policies. My testimony was not a vindictive speech. It was a call to make spaces safer, to keep HR channels independent, to create external reviews for serious allegations, to train managers to recognize bias. The board listened. They did not change overnight. They changed enough that, in the months that followed, other companies in the region adopted similar policies. That fact, small as it was in a world of larger headlines, felt like a settlement with the future more than it felt like a payout from the past. Custody never became a courtroom drama. The anonymous social services complaint had required investigation, but the investigators' findings, steadfast though bureaucratic, quickly cleared us. My son remained in my care. The threat had been real, but the system, when engaged correctly, had the capacity to correct itself. The episode taught me to be vigilant and to accept help without seeing it as a sign of failure. I let other people hold the line with me. That, more than any signature on a release, felt like a victory. I returned to the building, the one where I had once scrubbed a gum-sticky table and where now I walked in with an assistant and a list of items to review. There were new faces on the second floor. A plant shop had displaced a forgotten office. The mop closet existed now only in memory, a small, private relic. But the conference table remained, and I settled into the same corner where, years ago, I braced my knees while the light left the room for the day. At a staff meeting, I announced a new scholarship our company would fund for night school students studying facilities management and procurement. We didn't get here alone, I said. We were helped,
And we've learned the hard way that policies must be more than paperwork. They must protect people. The staff clapped.
One of the women who had been hired when Clearline was still a truck with a mattress in the back, the woman who had cried at our first payroll when she thought she'd been paid late, stood and said, "Thank you for believing in us." Her voice was rough with the years we had both weathered. The room felt like a place that had been fixed, not by a single hand, but by the slow attention of many small ones. There were small, ordinary scenes that marked the reconstruction of my life. My son and I painted the stairwell in his school with a sun that had a tiny frown, and then I made him add a bigger smile beside it. Luca called every week, long enough to catch up on the banalities of life, new tires, a birthday party, so the future could also be a sort of geography we planned together. Maya moved on to another firm, but left me a folder of notes and the address of an intern who now handled our compliance work. Maria kept the first client we had, and when we celebrated our 5th year as an incorporated business, we ordered a cake that read, "Clearline, built together." I still noticed detail the way an old janitor notices dust, the way a new receptionist's shoes scuff the tile, the way a broken lock will sag and threaten safety if no one tends it. Those instincts make me a steady leader, someone who sees the gap between policy and practice and fills it. Leadership, in the end, is a practice of repair. It is not about revenge. It is about the daily work of making systems that do not discard people for the convenience of others. I cannot say that all scars healed. There are nights when a headline will trigger muscle memory, and the old fear will find a place to sit. Sometimes when a new rumor curls like smoke at the edge of a feed, I have to remind myself that truth accumulates slowly and stubbornly when tended. The victory I won was not cinematic. It was procedural and moral, and in a way that matters more, practical. I had rewritten my place in a system that once erased me by building institutions that would prevent future erasures. One winter evening, the office smelled faintly of lemon, the cleaner we still used on the 2nd floor. I found a crayon drawing between the pages of a policy manual. Some child had slipped it in and taped it down until it stuck. It was a small house, a sun, and a stick figure with a mop. Someone had scrawled beneath in a childish hand, "Keep people safe." I pressed the paper to my lips and kept walking. We cannot undo everything that was done. I cannot put the years back into their neat places like books on a shelf, but I can set up shelves so that the next person who is pushed aside finds a place to stand. I can be the leader who turns a mop closet into a training space, who turns a rumor into an exhibit, who keeps a list of policies that say people are more important than reputations. I can sit at the head of a table and make decisions that protect the janitors, the clerks, the people who make buildings habitable. When people ask me if it was worth it, if the fight, the nights awake, the way my son once found notes in his backpack were worth the eventual clearing, I have a simple answer. It was necessary, I say. Necessary is not the same as triumphant. Necessary is the difference between what must be done and what we hoped would be done for us. I learned to be necessary. Years after the mop bucket clacked against the linoleum and a security guard pushed open a closet door as if to make a point, I still keep one dented key on a ring by my desk. It is not the executive key, that is brass and serious. The dented key is a relic, a childhood prayer in metal. On bad days, I turn it in my hand and remember that someone once thought I could be discarded. On better days, I hand it to a new hire and say, "Keep this. Remember where you started." We cannot make every wound whole, but we can build places that refuse to let wounds be weapons. We can teach a child that truth matters because it is how we live. We can, in the quiet ways that matter, protect the innocent. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more stories of comeback and courage.